want to take a look at order management and making sure that, or showing different ways of how we manage documents in the system, transactional based documents in the system. So the biggest way that we do that, and what we feel really sets us apart from our competitors, is the workflow component of SalesPad Cloud. So with that, again, we can manage, using the workflow, we can set that up to manage those transactional documents. It's a rule-based workflow system, so that we are an action-based workflow system. So based off of certain criteria, we can execute one or more actions. Those actions can be applying a hold to an alert to a transaction. It could be moving that transaction to a different step in the workflow. It could be sending out emails. It could be transferring the order to Invoice. There's a number of different things that we can do, and all those things could be combined. And so we'll walk through that. So again, for us, workflow, and I'm going to primarily concentrate on workflow on the sales document side, although workflow is available for any of our transactions. So we have sales workflow, we have inventory adjustment workflow, we have purchasing workflow, we have receiving workflow, and we have assembly workflow. Again, those sales tends to be where we see it used the most, and typically where we set up the most complex workflow within the system. So we're going to concentrate on setting up a workflow, or looking at a workflow that I have set up for sales. You'll notice in the navigation screen on the left-hand side, we have these drop-down arrows. So anywhere that we have workflow existing in the system, on those transactions, you'll have those drop-down arrows which allow you to expand and see documents broken up within your workflow. So again, I have workflow set up for a number of different transaction types, but again, going back, I'm going to concentrate on the sales workflow. For us, workflow, again, specifically on the sales side, we want that to represent a step in our business process. So each batch on that workflow is that step in our business process. And so again, it can be as simple or it can be as complex as you want to set that up to be. The one thing that I will mention, though, is that workflow, there is a manual button press that is required by a user to trigger that workflow or to push documents out into that workflow. So you don't want to get so complex that you have to waste time by having some user move a document through the workflow just so that you have that broken down into some very granular step in your process. So typically what we want to see is a good mesh between representation of your business process and then efficiency on the time side, so that again, you've got good visibility, but it's not a waste of your time to have to manually move those documents. So workflow movement can be done on a document by document basis, or it can be done on a batch basis. So I can take an entire batch of documents and move them at one time throughout the workflow. When we do a batch movement, each document is still evaluated individually within that workflow. So if there is a rule that you have set up in the workflow that would need to do something to that document or take action against that document, it is still going to evaluate each document. And so then it would grab, one or more documents that meet that condition and could change their path in your workflow or execute some other action. So we have our sales workflow on the left here. Workflow can be set up and specified by sales document type. So if we look at my sales document type setup, here under my so I'll look at my order, I have my workflow dropdown, and this is where I can specify what workflow, what sales document workflow I want this order document type to use. In this case, I'm using sales. I will also point out that when we set up a new system, we do default in basic workflows for each of your transaction types. So you'll see those across the top. I have an all tab, and then I have a sales and purchasing, and again, each of those transaction types that are allowed to have a workflow. But we do default in a workflow because it is required when you set up your sales document types, and then whenever you create any sales order, we will put that document in that first batch. So I am going to use the workflow that we add by default is called sales. I have made some additional changes to this workflow. By default, it only has one sales batch, in this case, sales documents. So I have 3 batches set up, 3 steps in my workflow right now. I could add additional steps. So if I wanted to add a new batch, I'm going to call this my warehouse batch. And we will just name. So I give my document or my batch a name. That is a user-defined name. You can name that whatever you like. Again, The idea is that those batch names are representative of your process. And so in this case, I'm just going to call it warehouse. This is going to be where my documents go that need to be picked, packed, and shipped. My forward label is the button that shows up in the top right of your sales transaction. And that's the button that the user has to click to push the document out into the workflow and let that workflow and those workflow rules and actions be evaluated and executed. And then I have an inactive flag. I also have a sequence flag, and that sequence flag just dictates the sequence that the workflow is displayed both in this setup screen and then in my drop down, because the user can manually move documents throughout the workflow. So in this case, I want this to be in between my sales document and my ready to invoice. So I'm going to make this a 15, and then I'm going to save my new batch, and it's going to update my screen, and I'm going to see that new workflow show up within or show up in between sales documents and ready to invoice. So now we see that I have my workflow batch showing up in the middle there, or now in between my sales document, my ready to invoice. The only other step that I would need to take is my forwarding batch. And so this is where I can specify what batch. Okay, so when I hit the release button, again, I have the button labeled. When I hit release, what batch should this document or the documents move to? And so in this case, I want them to move to ready to invoice. Now, I also can go back and edit these. As you'll notice, I don't have a button caption on some of these other ones. And so again, I'm just going to put my release button caption on all of those as well. And again, they could be named something specific to the action that you're doing, or if you need to, if you're using a ready to pick batch and you want to forward that to ready to ship, you could have the label be picked, and then you could have the label be something else going from the next batch on. So again, I'm just going to clean this up a little bit, make sure it has my workflow laid out the way that I would expect it to. Now, those types of changes, when made on this screen, do not require you to click save. They get saved automatically by the system when you make those changes. So I've made my changes. I have my documents or I have my workflow laid out. And now we want to take a look at those rules. Again, there's nothing really complex to setting up this screen. Again, it comes back to that balance between to your efficiency, and then to your to that visibility of those documents. The other thing I will point out too is that this is my sales workflow, so this is what I have assigned to my orders. I also have another workflow. If we back up one step and go back to our workflow screen, I also have a separate workflow for my invoice. And so I don't want to merge managing documents of different document types within the same workflow, because that can get very confusing, and then you start losing some of that visibility. And so I like to keep my workflow separate by sales doc type. So I want to have a workflow for my order, and I want to have a workflow for my invoice. The other thing that I like to do here as well is break this up by sales channel also. So if I have multiple document types, so let's say I have my manually entered orders, and then I have Shopify orders that I'm managing from my Shopify website. I want those to go to different doc types, and I may want those to flow through different workflow as well. So sometimes they will have different pieces. POS is another good example, using SalesPad POS. I typically want to have that hit a completely different workflow. Typically, I don't really have workflow when it comes to the POS documents, because the idea is that the customer has paid for the product, taken the product with them, and walked out the door, so that document is considered completed. And so there's some other things that we can do with that workflow, things like auto posting those sales receipts as they integrate over from the SalesPad POS system. So just again, some couple notes there to be aware of when we're looking at the workflow. So I click on my sales workflow, my workflow monitor on the left-hand side, and I can now see that this document or this batch shows up under my sales workflow. The idea behind this screen is it's going to give me a quick look at where my documents are in the system. So I have 35 sales documents, or 35 documents sitting in my sales document batch, with a total of $7.8 thousand. So $7,800. And again, we're going to round this. This is going to give you just an approximation of the amount of documents, or the dollar amount of documents that you have sitting out there. So as we move documents through this screen updates independently of the rest of the app. And so it'll update periodically and give you an updated look of, or an updated view of, the number of documents and the amount of documents sitting in each step. So again, this brings up other things, or other items to be aware of. So Another thing or another process that we see happen often is at the end of the day, somebody's going to look at what's sitting in the warehouse. Maybe they have a process or their process is set up that they want to have all of their orders that have gone to the warehouse shipped on that same day. They don't want to have anything sitting out in the warehouse waiting to be picked. And again, typically they're going to have other batches set up that are holding batches for those other documents. So maybe you have a back-ordered queue or batch where documents are waiting to be purchased, or you have a waiting for product batch where you've got documents that are purchased, but you haven't received that product in yet, and so you'd want to have your documents sitting there. But I want my warehouse batch cleaned up at the end of the day, so I have 0 documents there and $0 there. And so again, this gives you a good check. So at 4:30 today, I may go check my warehouse batch and make sure that I don't have any documents sitting out there waiting to be processed or waiting to be taken care of by my warehouse group. And again, I can quickly see that here. I don't have to go run some report. I don't have to go look at some other screen. On any screen, it doesn't matter. I can click the drop down next to sales and be able to see the transaction count and the dollar amount within that batch. So going back to my sales workflow, we're going to take a look at the rules that are available and that I have set up. I didn't mention the inactive flag, but I can add batches, and then if I decide not to use them later, flag them as inactive. The one thing I will caution you on, before flagging those as inactive, make sure you've moved all of your documents out of that batch. It just makes it easier for you to manage those documents. If you then make it inactive, it's very hard to get them out of the batch without going back, making it active again, moving the documents, and then coming back to this screen and making them inactive. So just to show a few hints of or how that we would navigate documents with our workflow, I'm going to go back over to my sales monitor here on the left, click on sales documents. So this is going to show me those 35 sales documents or sales transactions that are sitting in the sales document batch, and we can see the batch name here. They all say sales documents. So if I go into any of these documents, and I'm just going to randomly pick one. So on this sales document or this sales transaction in our sales document batch, we see our workflow batch that is listed here at the top right. We also see my action button. So this is the button I labeled release. And again, whatever you decide when you're setting up your workflow, whatever name you decide to assign to that button is what's going to show here. In my case, it is release. I can manually move this document throughout my workflow. The one thing I will caution you on though is that manually moving documents does not execute those workflow rules. And so this will bypass that workflow. So typically if we have rules set up, we want to not use this functionality or avoid using this functionality. That's where we want to use this button at the top to release it. So this is what pushes the document into the workflow and then gives us the chance to evaluate and execute that workflow. So we also have the ability on a sales batch. So again, I'm back in my sales document batch. I do have different doc types in here, so it is possible or it is available for you to do. It's just not something that I would recommend. But I do have some batch actions that I can do. So by selecting all the documents within the batch, I could post these if I needed to. I could forward the selected documents. So this is how we would do that batch forward. I would then push those documents. Again, it would evaluate every document or each document individually, but it will push that document into whatever the next step is in their workflow. Allocate documents. And again, this doesn't use workflow, just attempts to allocate all the documents within the batch. Transfer, this is transferring those orders to an invoice. And then I can batch print. So again, there's additional batch functionality that we have once you have defined and put those documents into a batch. Now this doesn't mean that you have to go set up custom workflow to have those batch actions. They're going to be there because again, we do default in a workflow out of the box for you. It's just a single batch workflow, and I believe it is just called sales documents within that sales workflow. All right, back over to our setup screen. So if we drill into my sales workflow, again, I have my batches. Now we're going to look at our rules section. And our rules are, so these are specific to actions or evaluations criteria that can be ran when documents either enter a batch or they exit a batch. And again, we can specify when that action takes or we want those rules evaluated. So in this case, I have 4 rules. Again, sequence is the same thing that we have for when we set up the batches. So I can hit the new rule button to add a new rule. In this case, I'm going to name my rule whatever I want to call it. we like to be very descriptive with our rule names. So maybe I want this to be a margin rule. And we actually want to check for documents below margin. So whenever we add a new rule, it defaults to inactive. We do that specifically because we don't want this rule to be enabled until you're ready for it to be enabled. So we don't want you to create a rule and you're not ready for it to start manipulating documents when users are releasing documents out into that workflow. And so again, it's going to default to inactive. You need to set it as active for that rule to start being, to be called by the system and evaluated. We have alerts. So alerts are assigned on a document by document basis. So whenever this rule, the criteria are met, this alert would be added to the document. And so in this case, we're just going to name this document below margin. And we want this to run, I'm going to have this run on exit of batch. So that whenever a user releases a document and pushes it out in the workflow, when it exits whatever batch I specify, which I'll show you next, it will then run this rule, and if it applies to if the rule criteria applies to the document, then it'll execute whatever action or assign that alert. So once I do that, I have this rule section that shows up here on the right. On the right-hand side, I can then specify what batch this rule applies to, so it can apply to one or more batches. And this, I have it on exit batch, so what batch is the document coming out of that I want this document to be evaluated. So once I have my rule set up and I've specified the pieces here, I'm still going to leave it as inactive, but I'm going to go ahead and save new rules. So now this makes it active, and then it gives me the ability to start setting up my rule changes on the right-hand side. So rules are specific to these to the rules on the left-hand side. The rules on the right, the rule criteria on the right is specific to the rule that I've selected on the left. And so as you see, as I go back and forth through this screen, it updates and you'll see that there's specific things that change. So we default in rule criteria that you need to fill out before you make this active, and really before the rule will actually do anything. So I have my batches, my list of batches across the top. So this rule can be evaluated on one or more batches, in this case on exit of those batches. I really want this to run coming out of the first batch. So my sales documents is my first batch. And then I can have one or more conditions. Based off of those conditions, I can have one or more actions. And those also have an enable box as well. So I could have the condition being checked and have an action that I had set up previously that I may no longer want to use. So I can still check the condition, but then I can mark the action as disabled or uncheck the enabled box, which means the action no longer happens, but the rule is still being evaluated. So we have a number of conditions that we can check. And again, conditions go in sequence order. I can add multiple conditions. So I have my list of conditions here. And in this scenario, I'm checking margin on the sales document. So I can go through and set sales document gross margin amount or gross margin percent. And so in this scenario, I can decide, do I want to check by a specific dollar amount or do I want to check by a specific percentage of my document? In this case, I'm going to do percentage. So I have my criteria operator, and I can check to see if my document is less than or greater than a specific percentage or equal to a specific percentage, and then I have greater than or equal and less than or equal. In this case, I'm going to do less than, and I have my criteria value. So this is a percentage amount that I'm going to be entering, and so in this case, I want to check to see that or make sure that my sales reps are not, or my order entry people are not entering an order for less than a percentage of an overall document percentage, gross margin percentage. And so in this case, I'm going to do 15%. I don't add the percent symbol, it's just a number. And so this is looking for sales document gross margin less than 15%. I also have my actions. So if this rule is evaluated as true, I have an alert that's going to be assigned, but I also may want to have an action executed on this document as well. And there's a number of different actions that we can do. Now, this is a little bit deceiving because I do need to click on the edit button to actually modify my action type and action finish. And so here are the different actions that we can execute. I can email it, I can post, I can transfer, I can change the workflow batch, or I can split a document. A lot of times we're just going to be changing the workflow batch, and so this means that I want the document to go to some other step in my workflow. Action finish, so you can have multiple actions set up if this action evaluates as true, what do I want to happen after that? Do I want to continue checking actions? Do I want to stop the action? Or do I want to skip any other additional actions? And so in this case, I'm just going to have this continue. Although I'm going to only have this single action, I can go ahead and set it to continue, or I could set it to stop, and that takes care of executing this document. It won't go any further or check additional actions after that. I can then specify where do I want this document to go. Now, I have a couple of options. Typically, I would set up a management review batch and have these types of documents go to management review. In my scenario, I'm just going to have them force the document to stay in the sales document batch, so they can't go into the regular, whatever the predefined next step is that I set up in my batches workflow. So I can save that. So it finishes or fills in this. I can then add a description. Again, this is just so that you understand exactly what's happened or what's going on. And so then I have a description if I need to come back at some later point and look at what I did with this rule and what this action was for. It can tell me. And again, workflow is a component of SalesPad that typically we see users modifying all the time. They may be refining their workflow every couple of days. So I have users that I've worked with that have on the Great Plains side or the GP side that modify their workflow every couple of months. Again, they run across scenarios that they haven't thought of that they need to catch. They add different scenarios that they want to catch. Maybe they're adjusting their margin rules. 15% may be too much on this. So maybe they need to drop that down to 10% or 12%. And so they may modify this quite a bit. And so it's good to keep as much description as possible on those rules and on those actions, so that if you're not the person that originally set this up, but you need to go look at it, it makes a lot of sense as to what they were doing. The other piece that I'll mention about rules is that rules fire off in sequence order. And so if this is the most important rule to me, then I want this to be the first one, the first document in the sequence, especially when it pertains to the specific batch. And I forgot to mark the sales document batch there. So I've saved my rule, and I want this evaluated on the sales document batch. And so again, if I want this to be the most important, maybe I'll change this to a 2 and I'll make this a 1. And so now that has modified the sequence that these documents will run and how they'll be affected on the system. So with those rules running in sequence order, so I can modify those, I've refreshed the screen, and now we can see that the documents are in a different order, the rules are in a different order than what they previously were, with my margin rule being on top. And then we can we would look at my backwards rule. And again, keep in mind, this is marked as inactive until I make it work. So I've been caught many times leaving this checked as inactive, go through, test my workflow, it doesn't work, and I can't figure out why. And then I come back and that box is still checked, which would explain why my rule would never run. So let's talk about some of the other conditions and some of the other functionality that we can do with workflow. So you'll see that I have some things set up here, transfer to invoice, email invoice, post invoice. Those I have flagged as inactive because that's invoice functionality that I want to run within my invoice workflow. And so if we go back to my workflow setup, under my invoice workflow, I have my 2 batches, new invoice and posting, and I have those same 2 rules that I've set up, emailing and posting. And so this does a couple of different things for me. So what this allows me to do is I actually have 2 separate workflows. I have my order workflow and I have my invoice workflow, and I have a number of different actions that happen on both. And so I'm going to jump back over to my order workflow real quick. So the idea is that I have documents that are sitting in ready to invoice and so you'll see I have this transfer to invoice rule that happens. So when my document is in ready to invoice and I release the document out, and so this is on enter of the batch, so when the document gets released and sent to the ready to invoice queue or ready to invoice batch, my condition is always, so I want this to always run. So I'm not evaluating any other rule, it's just set to always run. By the way, you have to have a condition for your action to execute, and so that is one reason that we have the always condition, so that you can specify that, which would then execute your action. And in this case, my action is to transfer this order to an invoice. And so if we go look at the setup for that, I have my action type of transfer. I want it to continue on, and I picked my sales document type that I'm transferring this document to. So in this case, I am transferring it to my invoice. So I have that action that takes place to transfer my order to an invoice, which would then put it in my invoice workflow. And within my invoice workflow, I have 2 batches and I have 2 rules. The first rule is an email. So whenever the document exits my new invoice batch, I have this condition set to always. I want to change my workflow batch, which moves my document, and then I also want to email. So if we take a look at this email functionality, I have it set as my action is email. It's a continue. I have the printed report that I want the email to send, and then I have my from email, my to email, and then the send to. So this is the customer's billing or the customer's contact who I want to send this to. So I'm going to use my billing address contact. So whatever email is listed on my billing address. So I have this email that will go to me, and then I also have it that it's going to go to whatever email address is listed on the send to contact for the customer that is on that sales transaction. So my first step then, or my first rule and action that happens is that I email that document, and then I forward that document on in the workflow to the posting batch. And then once it gets to the posting batch, I also have a second rule that is on enter of the posting batch. I want it to always run, and this is to post my transaction. And so I have the action type of post. Again, I have the action finish to set to continue, and then I can specify a post date. Now in this case, I've left my post date as blank. And if that's the case, then it's going to default to today's date as the posting date, or whatever date that I execute this action to use. Typically in this scenario, I don't want to specify a posting date, because otherwise it would use that posting date that's specified on every transaction that gets executed or pushed through this workflow. And for posting dates, that's not really going to be applicable or needed. So what does this workflow do for me then? So what this allows me to do is then I can take an order. When I'm ready for that order, my warehouse is ready for that order. They've picked, they've packed, they've shipped that order. Or I'm pulling it out of some other system, like I'm pulling it from ShipStation, signifying that that document has been shipped. I could then transfer or move that order out of my workflow batch into my ready to invoice batch. At that point, the workflow fires, transfers those orders to an invoice. Those invoices then hit the first batch in my invoice workflow, and then these rules pick up under my invoice workflow. So it will then email my document out for me, out to whatever I've set up in that workflow rule. And then it'll move that document to the next batch, my posting batch in the workflow, and then it'll automatically post that document for me. So really it shows the power of the workflow in that we can do all of this hands off in the system. So all we have to do is be ready to transfer that or move that order to the ready to ship or the ready to invoice batch. And then the workflow kicks in and takes care of everything for me. So again, this can really streamline the process of having to manage those orders, transferring those orders to an invoice, emailing those invoices, and then posting. So again, there's a lot of different things like that we can do with that workflow, which will make users' jobs easier and make them have to do less things within the system, and let the system handle those things for you. Again, those types of functionality, a lot of times those should be hands-off functionality anyway. There's no real need for the user to have to go through and manually move those documents from step to step to step. And again, you can customize that however you see fit. Sometimes we'll see customers that want to split that process up. So maybe they don't want to just let the system email those documents out for them. So that's fine. Then we could change this up a little bit. We can make it to where, okay, now it's only going to transfer the orders to invoice for me. And then I have control over what I want to do, whether I want to print those invoices, whether I want to email those invoices, whether I want to split them up and email a group of them and print a group of them. And then I can release the document out. So I could just simply make this as inactive. Now, the emailing portion is taken out of it, as well as the move workflow or change workflow batch. So that's gone from my setup. And now all I have to do is just, I take care of my printing and my emailing, and then I release the documents back into the workflow. That will then move them to the posting, and that's where my posting rule takes effect and automatically picks those up and posts them for me. So again, there's a lot of different ways that users can use the workflow functionality to make their life in the system easier. So another great example is the POS side. So we have POS sales receipts that are coming over from the POS system. There's no real need for me to have to manually post those transactions, out on a daily basis, when we can have the system do that for you. And so what that does is it's going to post those transactions. So POS comes over on a time schedule. The integration runs on a time schedule from POS into Cloud. Cloud will then pick up those sales receipts. It'll then post those sales receipts, which means the next time the QBO integration runs, you see up-to-date QBO integration. And so we're at a close to real-time update from POS to Cloud, from Cloud to QuickBooks Online. So your inventory in Cloud is staying up to date, more so because those sales transactions will allocate inventory. But now with the posting process, you're actually removing on-hand quantity with that posting process. So you're now seeing your on-hand quantity updated close to real time. And then you're seeing financial information updated close to real time on the QuickBooks Online side. So you're seeing your daily sales numbers. You'll see those increase throughout the day as the posting happens. So again, you're now you're getting a much quicker picture of your day-to-day processing and how that's being processed and how your documents are looking throughout the system without the user really having to do anything as a manual process within the system. We can also do that same type of functionality on any of these other transactional types that have workflow for them. So we can do the same thing with adjustments, maybe adjustment outs. I want to go ahead, instead of me having to post those, maybe I want to queue those up. So I want to build out a bunch of adjustments, release those documents or release those adjustments into the workflow and let the workflow auto post those for me. Again, I could do the same thing for receiving. I could have that same type of process in my receiving workflow where I set up multiple different steps. Maybe I have a more complicated receiving process where I need to create my receipts. I need to print labels. I need to apply those labels. Once I'm done applying those labels, I might have a quarantine process that I need to go through and evaluate that inventory before I ever actually put that inventory into the system and create my vendor bill. And so we can create those steps in the receiving workflow. And then once I'm ready, release that out and let the workflow take care of the posting side for me. So again, there's multiple different ways that we can execute that workflow. And with those rules and those criteria, there's a large number of criteria that we can check. Criteria are also easy for us to add. So if there's a criteria there that makes sense that we don't have in that list, let us know, let support know, and we can look at adding that into that criteria.